Module 7, Statistical Reasoning in Everyday Life. In descriptive, correlational, and experimental research, stats are tools that help us see and interpret what the unaided eye might miss. Sometimes the unaided eye misses really badly. Researchers invited 5,522 Americans to estimate the percentage of wealth possessed by the richest 20% of the people in the country. Their average person's guess was 58%, which dramatically underestimated the actual wealth inequity, which is the wealthiest 20% possess 84% of the nation's wealth. The need for statistics. Accurate statistical understanding benefits everyone. To be an educated person today is to be able to apply simple statistical principles to everyday reasoning. One needn't memorize complicated formulas to think more clearly and critically about data. Off-the-top-of-the-head estimates often misread reality and then mislead the public. Someone throws out a big round number, others echo it, and before long the big round number becomes public misinformation. A few examples. 10% of the people are lesbians or gay men. Or is it 2 to 3% as suggested by various national surveys? We ordinarily use about 10% of our brain. Or is it closer to 100%? The human brain has 100 billion nerve cells. Or is it more likely 40 billion, as suggested by sample counts? The point to remember: doubt big, round, undocumented numbers. Statistic illiteracy also feeds needless health scares. In the 1990s, the British press reported a study showing that women taking a particular contraceptive pill had a 100% increased risk of blood clots that could produce strokes. This caused thousands of women to stop taking the pill, leading to a wave of unwanted pregnancies and an estimated 13,000 additional abortions, which were also associated with increased blood clot risk. And what did the study find? 100% increased risk indeed, but only from 1 in 7,000 women to 2 in 7,000 women. Such false alarms underscore the need to teach statistical reasoning and to present statistical information more transparently. Descriptive statistics. How do we use descriptive data? And what is its relative usefulness? Once researchers have gathered their data, they may use descriptive statistics to organize their data meaningfully. One way to do this is to convert the data into a simple bar graph called a histogram. This displays a distribution of different brands of trucks still on the road after a decade. At least figure 7.1 does. You're looking at a different one. When reading a statistical graph such as this, hang on, let me see if it's right here. The secret lies in how you label the vertical scale. There we go. This displays the distribution of different brands of trucks still on the road after a decade. When reading statistical graphs such as this, take care. It's really easy to design a graph to make a difference look big or small. The secret lies in your vertical scale. The point to remember is think smart. When viewing figures in magazines and on television, read the scale labels and note their range. You can see with a more reasonable labeled vertical scale that the difference is relatively small. Measures of central tendency. The next step is to summarize the data using some measure of central tendency. a single score that represents a whole set of scores. The simplest measure is a mode, the most frequently occurring score or scores. The most commonly reported is the mean, or arithmetic average, the total sum of all scores divided by the number of scores. On a divided highway, the median is the middle. So too with data. The median is the midpoint, the 50th percentile. If you arrange all the scores in order from highest to lowest, half will be above the median and half will be below. In a symmetrical bell-shaped distribution of scores, the mode, mean, and median scores may be very similar, or even the same. Measures of central tendency neatly summarize data, but consider what happens to the mean when a distribution is lopsided or skewed. By a few way-out scores. With income data, for example, the mode, median, and mean often tell very different stories. This happens because the mean is biased by a few extreme scores. When Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates sits down in an intimate cafe, its average mean customer instantly becomes a billionaire, but the customer's median wealth remains unchanged. Understanding this, you can see how a British newspaper could accurately run the headline, "Income for 62% is below average," because the bottom half of the British income earners receive only a quarter of the national income cake. Most British people, like most people everywhere, make less than the mean. The mean and the median tell different true stories. A point to remember, always note which measure of central tendency is reported. If it is a mean, consider whether a few atypical scores could be distorting it. Measures of variation. Knowing the value of an appropriate measure of central tendency can tell us a great deal, but the single number omits other information. It helps to know something about the amount of variation in the data. How similar or diverse are the scores? Averages derived from scores with low variability are more reliable than averages based on scores with high variability. Consider a basketball player who scores between 13 and 17 points in each of her first 10 games in a season. Knowing this, we would be more confident that she would score near 15 points in her next game than if her scores had varied from 5 to 25. The range of scores, a gap between the lowest and the highest, provides only a crude estimation of variation. The range of scores provides only a crude estimate of variation. A couple of extreme scores in an otherwise uniform group, such as the 950,000 and 1,420,000 incomes, in one of the measures that you're going to see, will create deceptively large ranges. The more useful standard for measuring how much score deviates from one another is a standard deviation. It better gauges whether scores are packed together or dispersed because it uses information from each table. The computation assembles information about how much individual scores differ from the mean. If your high school serves as a community where most families have similar incomes, then family income data will have a relatively small standard deviation compared with a more diverse community population outside of your school. You can grasp the meaning of standard deviation if you consider how scores tend to be distributed by nature. Large numbers of data, heights, weights, intelligence scores, grades, though not incomes, often form a symmetrical bell-shaped distribution. Most cases fall near the mean, and fewer cases fall near either extreme. This is figure 7.3, and it shows a useful property of the normal curve is that roughly 68% of the cases fell within one standard deviation on either side of the mean. About 95% of cases fell within two standard deviations. Thus, about 68% of people taking an intelligence test will score within 15 points of 100. About 95 plus or minus 15 points. About 95% will score within 30 points. This is the normal curve. Scores on aptitude tests tend to form a normal or bell-shaped curve. Inferential statistics. How do we know whether an observed difference can be generalized to other populations? Data are noisy. The average score in one group, breastfed babies for example, could conceivably differ from the average score in another group, bottle-fed babies, not because of any real difference, but merely because of a chance fluctuation in the people sampled. How confidently, then, can we infer that an observed difference is not just a fluke, a chance result of your sampling? For guidance, we can ask how reliable and significant the differences are. These inferential statistics help us determine if results can be generalized to larger populations. When is an observed difference reliable? Representative samples are better than biased samples. As noted in Module 5, the best basis for generalizing is not from the exceptional and memorable cases one finds at the extremes, but from a representative sample of cases. Research never randomly samples the whole human population. Thus, it pays to keep in mind what population a study has actually sampled. Third bullet point, less variable observations are more reliable than those that are more variable, As we noted in the example of the basketball player whose game-to-game points were consistent, an average is more reliable when it comes from scores with low variability. Finally, more cases are better than fewer. An eager high school senior visits 2 university campuses each for a day. At the first, the student randomly attends 2 classes and discovers both instructors to be witty and engaging. At the next campus, the 2 sampled instructors seem dull and uninspiring. Returning home, the student, discounting the small sample size of only the 2 instructors at each institution, tells friends about the great instructors at the first school and the bores at the second. Again, we know it, but we ignore it. Averages based on many cases are more reliable than averages based on only a few. The point to remember, smart thinkers are not overly impressed by a few anecdotes. Generalizations based on a few unrepresentative cases are unreliable. When is the difference significant? Perhaps you've compared men and women's scores on laboratory tests of aggression and found a gender difference, but individuals differ. How likely is it that gender difference you found was just a fluke? Statistical testing can estimate the probability of a result occurring by chance. Here's some underlying logic. When averages from 2 samples are each reliable measures of their respective populations, then the difference is likely to be reliable as well. Example, the less variability in women's and in men's aggression scores, the more confidence we would have that any observed gender difference is reliable. And when the difference between the sample averages is large, we have even more confidence that the difference between them reflects a real difference in their populations. In short, when sample averages are reliable and when the difference between them is relatively large, we say the difference has statistical significance. This means that the observed difference is probably not due to chance variation between the samples. In judging statistical significance, psychologists are conservative. They are like juries who must presume innocence until guilt is proven. For most psychologists, proof beyond a reasonable doubt means not making much of a finding unless the odds of it occurring by chance, if no real effect exists, are less than 5%. Lastly, when reading about research, you should remember that given large enough samples, a difference between them may be statistically significant, yet have little practical significance. Point to remember, statistical significance indicates the likelihood that a result will happen by chance, but it does not say anything about the importance of the result.